Hi everyone and welcome to this coloured pencil masterclass. So I've recently completed this same drawing once in graphite and once in pastel pencils, and now it was my third time drawing this, but in my most used medium and my most trusted medium and the medium I'm most familiar with, obviously coloured pencil. I feel like I've done quite a few eye studies in the past, but I really wanted to make this one super in-depth to go with the others, other sort of pastel graphite masterclasses that I've done, and almost to demonstrate the difference between the mediums and how they can achieve different results depending on obviously what you're after, and also what medium that you're most familiar or comfortable with. So as always, I have all my I've written everything in the materials list. I would recommend with both the coloured pencil and the pastel one to have a scrap bit of paper beside you for scribbling, and also just to create these swatch sheets where you can just go through colours. And I find these so useful. I haven't done it yet with pastel pencils, but these are my coloured pencil ones, and I can just sort of refer to my reference photo and sort of go, right, okay, I think that colour is a little bit accurate. Well, a little bit accurate. I think that colour mixed with that colour will work. So I'll use a lot of luminance as the base layers because they're super soft, super blendable, and they create a really nice smooth sort of base layer, and then obviously go into details using the colour swatch sheets as we go. I don't think there's much housekeeping for this one. I think it's just going to be straight to it. A lot of different colours. I'll try and break it down as much as I possibly can, as always, starting at the eye as I have done for the other two, and then working around. I don't know how long this is going to take. I don't know how long this masterclass is going to be, but it's fine. I've got a good week or so to work on this if need be. So as always, going to start out with just plotting in the darker parts. I'm going to use a little bit of the dark sepia to begin with, and just trying to sort of establish where those darker areas are. You only want to be using a very light pressure to be doing this, and again, just sort of really establishing where those darker markings are. Now what I might do is use a graphite pencil because I feel like my line art isn't that great. The line art I would have provided you is a lot more detailed than this one. Okay, so I've just lightly sort of sketched in a little bit of that detail on where sort of areas are layered and blend together a little bit more. Well, just really put in the detail more than anything else. And I'm now just going to, again, start to very gently and lightly map out with a bit of the dark sepia. Quite confidently just go and just, but I say confidently, but I'm also only using a light pressure just to really go in and kind of just put in some of those darker lines, just running that pencil over the top. So I always really like to start out with just marking out those darkest of areas. I find it a lot easier then to work out my values. So I'm not going in with the heaviest pressure. I do want to keep this quite light just in case at the moment I make any mistakes with my line work. That's why I'm also using the dark sepia and not going straight in with black at this point. So I'm just marking around the eye. When we're drawing eyes, and to be honest, most animal related things, even though a lot of, like when we draw an eye, we're thinking, right, it's sort of almost like a circle. One thing we don't want to do is keep our lines really harsh underneath here. So you'll never see me just going circling around and really creating a harsh line around. I'll always put a lot more depth at the top because that's obviously where the eye is sort of going into the shadow. But down here, there's normally a lot of highlight, and the highlights sort of blend together a little bit. So you're never going to have a really harsh line at the bottom. So that's why I always try and avoid putting anything like that in. So especially through here, you can see there's no harsh line, it's quite light, but there is a bit of darkness through here. So just paying really close attention to where things do look a lot darker. And at this point, where I've got a little bit more confidence with where I know that's going to be a super dark area, I am just going to take a bit of black. It's just going to make it a little bit easier for me to kind of establish those values a little bit more. So just beginning to just mark around with a light pressure a little bit of that black. Now, I'm not going too far into this area above because again, there's a little bit of a highlight. I'm just trying to keep everything nice and soft. And just paying really, really close attention to those shadows that are sort of formed just below the eye. And you can probably see that there's different tones within the shape up here. So there's a bit of brown, but just below, right at the top of this eye, there's almost like a little bit of a bluer, cooler kind of tone. So I'm just going to use a little bit of Payne's Grey, just again over the lower portion of that black, and just blending, bringing a little bit down that Payne's Grey. And when we're looking at the colour spectrum, or the colour wheel, you'll notice that the blue is quite over the opposite side of where the orangey tones are. So when we're drawing in an eye that's got a lot of sort of sort of amber tones and a lot of orange and reds, I really do like to add quite a lot of blue in the shadows, because again, it just makes everything come to life a lot more. So even though this looks like it's a really dark, just black, I'm just going to put in a bit of the Payne's Grey in with that black, which again is just going to help create a little bit more of that depth. So when we're working on a surface like Fabriano, one of the key things to remember is it's not like pastel matte, and you can't really blend the colours together that well. So you need to be aware of the colours that sort of work, how the different pencil types work with the paper. Now, you don't have to follow my methods here, but it is quite important that you are aware that you can't sort of blend the colours that well. So that's why I really do like to take the Luminance, because they're a wax-based pencil and they're a lot sort of softer and a lot more blendable, in my opinion, than the Polychromos. So again, we've got a bit of a shadow through this area, but I almost want to keep my edges really, really light. And this is the great thing about the Luminance, because it kind of just, you can look how lightly you can just blend it, and you can just keep everything super, super soft looking. So again, just blending a little bit of that up, and I'm going to focus on adding some of those lighter tones again with the Luminance pencils. I really, really do like to use the Luminance as a bit of a base. So again, just taking I'm taking a little bit of the this is the burnt ochre 10%. I don't like to keep any of my graphite lines in when I'm working on light areas, just because it's quite easy for them to show through. And I'm not afraid that my burnt ochre is sort of blending into that darkest, I've just used a bit darkest sepia. It's not called darkest sepia, it's just in the Luminance range you've got the different percentages. So when I just say the darkest sepia, I mean the darkest like in that sepia range. And I'm also going to blend a little bit of the burnt sienna in with that burnt ochre, which is a bit more of a peachy, pinky colour, but it's going to give me a bit more of an accurate tone to what I'm after. Because sometimes the burnt ochre can just be a little bit too orangey, and sometimes I just want a little bit more of that pinker tone. Especially at the top here, where it's almost like a little bit purpley. and just using a really light pressure with the burnt ochre, because again you can blend other colours. So I could definitely take a little bit of this is the Light Flesh 10% again from the Illuminance. I will spend a lot of my time building up these colours with the Luminance pencils. So you'll notice what I'm looking for here when I'm creating these base layers. I'm looking at a reference photo and see those little highlights that are in between the browns and the reds. That's going to be my base, and I'm going to fill the entire eye with those base layers. I think a mistake that I definitely used to make when I was starting out was I just used to almost like draw the shape. So I'd be like, right, okay, so that area is that light colour, and then there's a little bit of a darker brown area, so I'll put that in. And you just got almost like a patchwork eye. Whereas obviously if we work this way, then it's a little bit more, you get a much, well, you do get a much smoother sort of effect. And if there's like an area where I know is going to be quite red over the top, again, I'm just going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna, maybe blend a little bit of the burnt ochre just in as well. But I know it's going to be quite dark and quite sort of pinky red, so that's why I'm just taking the burnt sienna. Again, just removing around. As I said, just I don't like to remove too much of the graphite too quickly, because again it's it just makes it slightly easier to map out where the detail is going to go over the top. Because even with these base layers, I'm using different shades to just kind of establish a little bit of where that detail goes. So if I know there's a darker area and it's going to be that deeper dark brown, I'm just going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna over the top, again, just to sort of establish those lighter areas compared to the darker ones. But again, we're just using a light pressure at this point. Don't want to press too heavy. The paper, if you were using the heaviest weight of Fabriano, which is a 640, it does take a lot of grams. It does take a lot of layers, but I still like to try and keep, you know, my initial layers quite light. And again, just blending between the burnt sienna and the burnt ochre. Honestly, it feels so nice to be back using this as a medium, because one of the things that I really struggle with, obviously not with the graphite, but with the pastel class, is the fact that the Faber-Castell Pitt pastels that I was using have the same, it's exactly the same colours as it is in the Polychromos, but they don't have names. So for like 181, it's Payne's Grey for the Polychromos, but in pastels it's just 181. So there was me going, oh, so now we're going to use a bit of Payne's Grey, and I was like, no, we're not, because it's 181. It doesn't actually have a name. But if you were used to work in Polychromos, then it is Payne's Grey. It's very confusing for me to kind of just like try and get my head around the differences, but I think we got there in the end. Again, just blending a little bit of the burnt ochre and some burnt sienna. Just trying to make, almost like the aim here is to try and make the tooth of the paper a little bit flatter. And you see there's a little bit almost like a glazed highlight through here, and it's almost like a little bit purpley, so I think we might just use a bit of the, it's too dark, maybe a bit of the sepia 10%, and just blending that in as well, which it does look super dark at the moment, but I promise you, once we sort of get everything else sort of in, it won't look that dark. And also, you can definitely just use, if you wanted to, a bit of like cold grey. You could take maybe like a little bit of the cold grey too over the top and just create a little bit more of that cooler blue tone. And again, it's just going to help smooth down the sheet of the paper. And then again, a bit of the burnt ochre. And again, just blending out between the burnt sienna. And as we start working towards those higher sort of light areas where it's got a little bit of that bluey grey tone, again, just gonna push a little bit of that of the cold grey too, just into those sort of slightly cooler areas, and just making sure I am blending it and pushing it and layering it over the top of where we've put a little bit of this sort of area, again, just to help make everything nice and smooth. And we can just almost take a little bit of the darkest sepia, just blend, again, just creating a little bit more depth. And so those sort of areas that we know we're going to have a little bit more of that deeper brown. And then again, some of the burnt ochre. Remember what I was saying about adding a little bit of a bluey tone underneath some of that deeper brown to create a little bit more depth? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to do over here as well. So it looks like it's got a slightly sort of deeper, sort of darker blue tone. So I'm just going to take some of the cold grey 4, and again, I'm just blending. And again, removing some of that graphite. And again, just some of the burnt ochre. It's very, you know, these base layers can be very much like patchwork. And I'm also just going to take a little bit of the silver grey just into those areas that I've got sort of that lighter bluey kind of glaze over the top, and maybe also a little bit of the violet grey, again, just because it's a bit more of that purpley kind of tone. So let's just zoom you in a little bit. And again, just as we start working into these lighter sort of areas at the top of the eye, this is obviously with the highlight, so we do want to be making sure that this area is really, really nice and light. So I'm just going to use a bit of the silver grey. I'm not going to go too far into this real lighter highlight at the moment. I'm focusing around it. And also I'm not focusing on the eyelashes, again, just focusing around that area. If you've got a little bit more of a yellowy tone, then maybe just take a little bit of ivory and blending that with some of the burnt ochre. Just again, keeping everything very, very light. And maybe a little bit of the burnt sienna at the top. again blending. Maybe even a bit of pink white. Because again, going in with these lighter colours, when we do sort of tone the paper and add a bit of like burnt ochre like I'm doing at the moment, it diffuses that colour a little bit so it's not as bright. Now obviously it's difficult to kind of know how this is all going to come together at this stage, but you just have to trust the process and just think that as long as you're getting your blue tones in a little bit, well, quite accurately. So I'm just taking a little bit of the Cold Grey 2, and again I'm just going to use some of the pink white just in those really brighter areas, just putting them as a bit of a glaze, and then a little bit of the sort of burnt ochre. And some of the violet grey, just to help tone the paper to be a little bit more of that bluey tone. Just putting in a light layer with the violet grey. Now this is a bit of an odd pencil because it feels quite weird. It doesn't feel like any of the other luminance pencils, so you just got to sort of again trust the process with this one. It feels a little bit sort of quite harsh and grainy and scratchy. And I'm also just going to take some of the sepia 50%, which is slightly sort of a purpley browny kind of tone, and again just starting to sort of build up a little bit of the contrast to those darkest areas, well, sort of the mid-tone darker areas. So again, making sure we've got enough layers underneath. You're looking for a feel. I go by feel when it comes to lots of colour pencil. I'm trying to just get that really nice sort of smooth buttery kind of feeling under my hand. That means that I know I've got enough layers down. Again, just sort of working in. And then just put in a whole sort of entire layer. This is quite a dark brown area, so I think I'm going to blend again a little bit of the burnt sienna into this one. At the bottom here, we've got almost like quite a lot of a lighter kind of shade range, and it's a little bit more of that yellowy tone, so, and less sort of orangey. So I'm going to take a little bit of the light flash and I'm just going to place that in all over, and then from there you can go in over the top with a little bit of the burnt ochre. But again, I'm only putting this in lightly, and I'm just kind of trying to feel for some of those details. I'm not getting too bogged down with it all at the moment. Again, just trying to remove some of that graphite. I'm just using a combination of the light flesh and the burnt ochre. I'm not going to take it too low because there's a lot of there's a few really light bright areas through here, whereas a lot of highlight. So I'm just going to just draw in around those. And again, just pushing a little bit of the burnt ochre into that dark sepia. That luminance darker sepia that we put in. And then again, just blending, keeping those highlights kind of free. And then just going to use a little bit of a grey under here. We've almost got a little bit of that lighter bluey kind of tone. So again, it's just trying to kind of establish what bluey tones to be using in order to get those sort of brighter highlights. So I think I'm just going to take a little bit of the cold grey too. And just bringing that down. A little bit, it doesn't matter if I go a little bit into that light flesh. I am going to take the light flesh and just blend it over the top and into that cold grey a little bit as well. And maybe just using some of the sepia 10%, again just through that area, because even though it's quite dark, this is a very dark area, so don't be afraid to go in. As long as you're using the 10%, you're never going to make it that dark, even though it looks quite dark on paper. The reality is we were going over with a lot of other dark colours. So just again glazing. This is going to be super dark brown soon, so we're just kind of putting in colours underneath it to make it look a little bit better, a little bit like it's got more depth to it. I'm also just going to use, I think, a little bit of the I'm actually going to use some of the Mars Black from the Light Fast range, which is a very, very deep, dark, reddy tone. And I'm lightly just going around the pupil. I'm not taking it too far into, that lighter colour around, but I'm just placing it through there. Then in the centre, I'm just going to take the black and just put a solid layer of black in. Because even though it looks like it's very dark blue, we can go over it with a bit of a blue tone to sort of correct the shade. But again, this is just adding a little bit of depth. Now, one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to take the black right to the edge or where we put that Mars Black, because we want to be able to blend it. So I'm just focusing it really on the centre and leaving about a millimetre or two around the outside. And then we can just take a little bit of the darkest sepia. And again, just blending over the edge there. I'm going to start building up some of these layers. So I'm going to take a little bit of chestnut from the Pablos, and if you don't have chestnut, maybe let's have a look and see the colour comparison between the burnt sienna. So the burnt sienna from the polychrome, it's very, very similar, actually very, very similar. So you can just take some of the burnt sienna. I don't think there's going to be much in it. But I'm also going to use some of the Caput Mortuum violet, which again is going to give us that really nice sort of reddy tone to come away from the pupil. And you can just take a little bit of the walnut brown over the top of the Caput Mortuum as violet as well, just to again just create a little bit more of that deeper brown tone and less of that reddy tone. So again, just blending everything on the paper as we work. And it is a little bit difficult to kind of establish, you know, how things kind of sit. And again, just going to take some of that Caput Mortuum. I think I might use actually the Caput Mortuum rather than the Caput Mortuum Violet. Just because I think it's a little bit less of that purpley tone and a little bit more of that brown tone. So yeah, I'm going to take some of the Caput Mortuum. And again, just working around the outside of the eye or the pupil. Just again, beginning to build up a little bit more. So you need to consider this that we're putting in at the moment as our sort of mid layer. So we're sort of just lightly pushing a little bit of pigment into the paper, just toning to get it a little bit more accurate to the colour we want. And this is where we can start to establish some of those details. So leaving out a little bit of that tone from underneath. And I'm also just going to use a little bit of the darker sepia from the Illuminance. And again, your colours, they don't have to be completely accurate to what you see. It's what you see. You might see completely different colours to me, and that's absolutely fine. But there's no right and wrong to any of this. One thing I really do like to do though is when we add any sort of deeper brown, as I said, I really like to go over and glaze a little bit of a bluey tone. So I'll take a little bit of the Payne's Grey, the darkest Payne's Grey from the Luminance, and again just lightly putting that in. And again, as we start to work into these darker brown toned areas, I'm just going to take some of the sepia 50%, which again is going to contrast quite nicely against the Payne's Grey. We can almost just add a little bit, I don't know, like some dark flesh, 40% in the middle, just again creating a bit more of that darker tone. And jumping around my pencils quite a lot here, but it's how I sort of again like to build up a little bit more of the contrast. So if I really want an area to be nice and dark in that bluey tone, then that's when I'm going to take a little bit of the Payne's Grey from the Polychromos, and again just beginning to blend a little bit upwards into that darker area, starting to establish some of those darker tones. And again, just going to take some of the burnt sienna and again a little bit of the Caput Mortuum just over the top of the burnt sienna, just in any of those sort of really deeper reddy kind of toned areas, but again leaving out a little bit of the underlayer showing through and just beginning to build up some of these details. Again, just adding more and more depth. And just going with the darker sepia, those really dark, sort of browny blacky tones. Like where I said there was that bit of Payne's Grey, so you can just take some of that. Well, there's a little bit of a deeper bluey tone through here. So again, you can just layer a little bit of Payne's Grey over the top. Then a little bit of the sepia, just again through those lighter areas, just start creating a little bit more of that purpley, sort of deeper bluey tone. And again, blending some of the Payne's Grey, darkest Payne's Grey from the Luminance, and just adding this into those blue, cooler toned areas. And then again, some of that violet grey. Some of the Payne's Grey over the top. And then again, I'm just going to establish some of the details with the burnt sienna 10%, but obviously we will be glazing, you know, sepias 50% over those more sort of grey toned areas. And again, I know this is quite a lot, but it's again just building up and blending, and it all looks a bit like higgledy-piggledy at the moment, and that's absolutely fine, it's going to, but again, it's one of those situations where you literally just have to trust the process and know that no matter what happens, the paper can take so many layers and that it will absolutely be okay. We're just trying to build up the depth. So again, I'm just taking a little bit of the Mars Black from the Light Fast range. And again, just beginning to blend. The thing is, I think it makes it a lot easier when we start to get rid of some of the lighter tones that are showing underneath. I think all the time that they're in there, it can make everything look a little bit sort of confusing. So again, just blending some of the some of the burnt sienna and some of the like Caput Mortem in over here, and again, it's just to help create a little bit more of that depth and darkness. And then again, just coming around underneath the eye. And again, it's very, very subjective to the colours, because again, you could get away with using, you don't have to use exactly the same colours that I use, but again, it's just kind of what works for me. So I'm just glazing into these sort of deeper, darker toned areas, and again, just blending. Something like Caput Mortem into those sort of more ready tones, and just filling in that area a little bit more. And then again, a little bit of the burnt sienna. And then again, just, this isn't necessarily the darkest layer we'll go in with, but I'm just taking a little bit of the Mars Black again, and just beginning to sort of blend a little bit of that, just again over those darkest areas, trying to maintain a little bit of light showing through, so we're not going to fill in the whole space. So hopefully you can begin to see how much as we're being able to darken up around the eye. And again, adding some of that burnt sienna, glazing that over as well. Just some more of those orangey toned lighter areas on the inside. And one great thing, I mean, I'll show you in a minute, but you can, it's quite easy to kind of just glaze over the top as well. So I'm going to use a bit of the burnt umber, and again just going really over those really darker areas and just creating that deeper, darker brown, but still keeping, the great thing about the burnt umber is you can kind of keep that orangey sort of brown tone running through. So just glazing, just using a light pressure just to help fill in the teeth of the paper a little bit more. And again, a little bit of the darker sepia, just to help blend out from that deep dark pupil. And again, just beginning to map out where some of those darker areas sit. Now, you can use different pressures when we're creating the details with these pencils. So if I just want to keep an area and sort of tone the paper a little bit, then I'm just going to use a light pressure. Whereas if I obviously want a lot more colour and pigment down, I'm going to press a lot heavier. And I'm also again blending, so I could put Mortem just gently into. And some of that burnt dark sepia again. And I know I'm jumping around, but then just taking a little bit of black just to really sort of hype up those contrasts. And one thing with the black, we never just want to keep sort of like an area super like a harsh line, so just always going to use the light pressure just to blend. That's why I like to sort of jump around my pencils a lot, because it makes it a little bit easier to blend. So I can just take a little bit more of the darkest sepia and just circular motions, and then going back in with the black, and again circular motions over the top just to create that smooth transition. And again just keep going backwards and forwards. You can equally just add maybe a little bit of the Payne's grey, just again to create a little bit more of that bluey tone, which is just going to sit so well against the orange. Like more orangey tones in this picture, and it's that juxtaposition of the browns and the oranges against the blues, which is going to make this eye really come to life. So really making sure we're working in the dark sepia to get those darks in. I'm also just going to take a little bit of the Payne's Grey 30% from the Illuminance and just begin to circular motion over the top, and also a little bit into the, see there's like these little sort of pockets of lightness, like sort of pencil markings. Like not pencil markings, I don't know what I'm on about. There's a few lighter areas is what I mean. And so I'm just gonna glaze over the top. And just again blending down. And layering through a bit more of the Payne's Grey. Not like any sort of light blue areas, we can just glaze over the top a little bit. And again, I think I'm also just going to take some of the violet grey and do exactly the same. So just pushing a little bit of this lighter grey through any areas and just almost glazing over the top, and it just creates almost like that glassy film on top, which again just creates another element of sort of a really lifelike eye. But I feel like you can only really do this with the Luminance pencils because they're obviously a lot softer, and just blend out. And then again a little bit more of the Payne's Grey, darkest Payne's Grey from the Illuminance. And then again some more of the, I'm going to use Walnut Brown just because it's slightly flatter sort of brown tone, but you could probably get away with using some of the darker sepia or even a bit of dark sepia from the Polychromos. And again, just blending. You don't have to get these highlighted areas completely accurate either. It's just kind of creating that illusion of a bit of lightness showing through. And again, you could equally just take a little bit of the burnt ochre, and again, just creating a little bit of a lighter shade. And then again, a bit more of the Luminance Payne's Grey. A little bit more of the burnt sienna, and again just going to take some of the burnt umber over the top and blend. And then again a little bit more of the burnt sienna just to build up these colours, and again leaving a little bit of that lightness showing through, but filling in any areas that have got a little bit more depth to them. And again just blending some of the Mars Black again to create those deeper, darker, reddy tones. Just leaving out those lighter areas a little bit. I'm also just going to take a little bit of the violet grey and just almost glaze over that Payne's Grey a little bit more. Just all of those sort of highlighted areas at the top here, because again, it's almost like we don't want this all that much detail. We've got a few sort of lighter So you just maybe take a Pablo Hazel. Just work a little bit of that orangey tone through. Again, this is all about sort of glazing. So we're putting in the dark colours and then we always go back in with a bit of the luminance, just to create the details and the real sort of glazed highlights almost. Again, just adding some burnt sienna. And some Payne's grey at the top, just to again sort of diffuse those areas a little bit more. And again, a bit thicker for autumn. And again, glazing. Some of the burnt sienna and the foot autumn. And just trying to push so it almost looks like you've got this darker area and it's sort of like going into that lighter area. So again, we can just take maybe a little bit of the darkest sepia, which is always sort of a vouch for this colour because it's like almost like a very dark brown that's quite easy to blend. And then through any of those lighter orangey areas, I'm just going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna. And then again, just blending some of the darker sepia straight through. If you wanted to, just again to kind of create a little bit of like a halfway house in between these lighter areas and the darker ones, you can just maybe take in some of those more orangey yellowy areas a bit of the burnt ochre from the polychromos. Again, only just adding it very, very gently through some of those lighter orangey areas, and then just going to take some of the burnt sienna over the top. And a little bit of the Payne's grey over the top where we put that cold grey too. Because obviously blending a little bit of the Payne's grey into those reddy tones, as I keep saying, creates a lot of depth. So don't be afraid to sort of mix your colours and add these sort of more hidden quote unquote colours. So hopefully you can see how much this is beginning to sort of gain contrast as we work in different areas and elements. And then again, putting a little bit more of the black through here just to gain the contrast. I'm just putting the black down a little bit into that Payne's grey area. And again, just working through into these details. Okay, and then we are just again going to just keep bringing down. I'm just trying to work out, that's a sort of quite a dark area, so that's the highlight through there. So sometimes you just got to take a moment to kind of really map out where those darker areas are, that they kind of sit just underneath there. So I'm just doing that with a bit of the Payne's grey. And again, just blending some of the burnt sienna. And then again, just a bit of the Payne's grey 30%. So basically what we're trying to do at the bottom here is, obviously, as I said, we don't want to keep any of it sort of too harsh, but there is almost like quite a lot of sort of lightness in between, when we just want to be incorporating those areas in as best we can. Now, obviously, as I keep saying, there is quite a lot of detail, but it's very, very fine detail. So what we want to be doing is adding the colours we see behind first. So making sure we've got it's light in the right areas and going into those darker areas a little bit sort of darker. So that's why I can take a little bit of like the silver grey, and maybe a bit of, I'd say even possibly a bit of buff titanium into this sort of area through here. A little bit more of that sort of bluey tone, so some Payne's grey, work it into this highlight. And I'm also, I think, for that really bluey tone, going to take a little bit of the cobalt light blue. Again, it's quite a sort of fierce blue colour, but I'm trying to build up my confidence with going in with quite heavy, harsh colours, because it basically just can make an area look a lot bolder and a lot more vibrant. So again, just drawing in around those shapes with some of the darker sepia from the Luminance. And a little bit of the Payne's grey. And again, cobalt blue and light Payne's grey 30%. Again, some of sepia. So just almost like trying to softly blend some of that Payne's Grey into the sepia, and into those dark areas around, just again, because we don't necessarily want there to be any harsh lines, we always want it to look like it's always kind of blended. Just creates a much softer, sort of more realistic finish to the eye. So that's why, you know, we can just add a little bit of the cooler sort of Payne's Grey bluey tones. Again, just glazing it all over the top. I'm also just going to take a little bit of the dark sepia, and I'm just going to glaze that down. And almost add maybe a little bit of the Payne's Grey, darkest Payne's Grey, and a little bit of the dark sepia just behind it. Again, it's just to create a little bit more of that sort of contrast. And you can definitely add a little bit of the darkest sepia. And blending so that Payne's Grey up and into. And maybe a bit of walnut brown, as long as we're keeping a sharp pencil, because we basically just want to be adding a bit of depth underneath through here with sort of a bit of brown to contrast against that bluey tone. But just keeping in mind we do want to keep that blue tone there, and just putting in a bit of black at the bottom again to really work in these highlights, or not the highlights but the shadow against the highlights. And then again, a little bit more of that Payne's Grey 30. And I know, again, this is probably quite complicated to follow, but just blending. I think it's going to look a little bit better when we start adding a bit more depth through there, because it won't look so sort of juxtaposed, is that the right word? From that lighter areas to those darker ones. And also we can just go in and glaze a little bit of this shadow, this bluey tone shadow through there as well. And I feel like maybe just adding a tiny bit more lightness through some of these lighter areas, then just going again in a little bit with black, just into that. And see through here we've got this real lighter area, so again just really want to make sure we're keeping that area, those lighter, it's that contrast, it's the dark against the lights that really make everything sort of come to life a lot more. So we really want to be making sure we're not filling in the lighter gaps between the dark and the lighter areas. So I'm just going to really work a little bit of that Payne's Grey, no, it's the light cobalt blue, sorry, in. Just giving it a sharpen and really making sure we're pushing it into those highlights. And again, just blending some of that burnt umber. Beginning to sort of build up a little bit more of the contrast through those lower areas. Again, building and putting a little bit maybe of some of the Mars Black, just because there is a little bit more of that reddy tone. And then again, some of that burnt sienna. Just working it around, leaving out some of those lighter little markings. And I'm just going to take a little bit of the burnt ochre and just again run it over those more orangey areas, just to again smooth them down a little bit more. Just trying to, again, just smooth with a bit of the burnt sienna. And some of the light flesh. Again, just want to kind of leave a little bit of that lighter area showing through. Put in a little bit of the burnt ochre. Okay, so I've just sharpened my Payne's Grey from the Polychromos. Now, if I want to go and really get some of these sharper details, I will always opt for using the Polychromos pencils, because I'm just able to get a much finer, sharper point than any of the other pencil brands that I own. And then again, just gonna take the light sky blue, light cobalt blue, sorry, and then a bit of Payne's grey over the top of the luminance, just again to really deepen and darken a little bit of that area through there. I'm just going to take a bit of the white from the Museum at Corel, and this is such a great white for really emphasising some of those highlighted areas, because this is just, you can just really work and get some of these nice bright contrasts in. Okay, so I'm just going to come to the inner corner of the eye. So there's a little line through here, which is almost like a, I think I'm just going to use a bit of dark flesh, I think, to be honest. So I don't want to go, I'm using the dark sepia at the moment, but I don't want to go sort of too far into that area there, because again, it's just going to make it too muddy looking. We've got a little bit of lightness at the top, so I'm going to put a little bit of the burnt ochre at the top, I think, and then some of that dark flesh working halfway down, and then leaving maybe a little bit like a light area through here. Just going to use a bit of white and just keep those lighter areas nice and bright looking through there. And then just using some of that dark sepia. And maybe a little bit of the burnt umber. And again, just taking a bit of black, just gently putting the black through. Working around the outside of the eye here with the dark sepia. And again, those real darker areas are just going to go in with a bit of black. Just really working that through. Some of that dark flesh. And then I think just because I want to keep the this area sort of quite dark, I'm just going to go straight in with the black. There is a tiny bit of detail going through here, so I'm just going to leave a few sort of lighter areas showing through. Like that, but for the most part I'm trying to make it as dark as possible. And then the same goes through here, just adding a bit more of that depth. And a little bit of the sepia 10%. Just into these sort of grey, I don't even know what that is. I think it might be some, is it something else? Oh, it's almost like just a little lighter marking. So leaving the inner part, the real inner part nice and light, and just going over that inner part with a bit of white, just so even if we go over it with a bit of colour, it's not going to change it too much.
And then going around the eye again, a bit of the black. So obviously got these little sort of inner highlights. So we're just going to leave the white of the paper showing through and just drawing in around those highlights. You could equally get a bit of like gouache or gel pen or something like that, but I just try not to go down that route if I can help it, just purely because I would like to try and keep... well, first of all, I don't think gel pen is really archival, and I think that's one of the biggest things when we're working with colour pencil, because we spend so much money on these pencils to make sure they're light fast, you know, they're not going to fade over time, and they're archival and all the rest of it. So it seems a bit counterintuitive to use a medium or use a sort of a tool that's not. The other thing you could definitely do as well is when we're trying to create these really light highlights, what you could do is go in with a bit of luminous white, place the white through, use the lighter areas, go over the top with a bit of black just to really re-emphasise So make sure you got a layer of the black in, of the white underneath. Try and go in with some details, just leaving out those lighter areas a little bit. But ultimately, the thing is, with doing it like that, you can go in with the slice tool and lift it up again. So just to demonstrate, you can just, again, go over where you put that white, and create these little sort of really brighter, lighter highlights. And in the middle of the, or in the eye, obviously we've got these little eyelashes, which are sort of coming down and creating a little bit of shadow and shape within the eye. So I'm just going to take my sharp black pencil and just draw in like so, and then I'm also just going to take a little bit of the buff titanium and just build in this highlight. So there's almost like a warmer yellowy tone right at the bottom, real light area through here, and then there's a little bit of like a light, cool, really cool blue kind of tone. So I think I'm just going to take a light pressure of some of the Coldgray 2. I'm just working around the outside, doesn't matter if we go over the top of where we put that buff titanium a little bit, just trying to keep that nice and light, and then we can just maybe add in a little bit of sepia, 10%, just to again blend a little bit of that sort of different shades in. Again, we just want to keep everything sort of quite light looking. Just adding in a little bit of contrast here and there, just blending areas out a little bit more. And then again, just adding a tiny bit of the buff titanium over the top just to help blend. And that's probably all I'm going to do for that little highlighted area. I'm going to as well just take a little bit of the French grey. This is French grey 30%, and I'm just going to layer this gently just underneath and into that sort of that darker area just below, but where it starts to transition and get into that lighter area. And then maybe using some of the Payne's Grey 30% just to help blend a little bit of that more bluey tone in. And again, this is just purely just I've gone for a slightly the French grey, just purely because it's a little bit more of that browny grey neutral tone, which we can definitely see coming down here through here a little bit more. And again, as I keep saying, the great thing about the luminance is the fact that we can go in with the slice tool over the top. So again, you can just maybe take a little bit of the cold grey to as our sort of lighter transition colour. I don't want it to be super light, because you spend a lot of time sort of really reworking areas. But it's all about sort of getting these base layers as accurate as possible. So like layering a little bit of French grey over the top into those warmer areas, just again to help create a little bit more depth. So blending some of the French grey and maybe a little bit of the Payne's grey as well, 30%, just to get that really nice neutrally kind of cooler blue tone, making this area nice and dark. So obviously the aim of the game here is to really make sure this area is nice and light. You could even add a little bit, maybe I put a little bit of a cold grey down, so maybe like a bit of cold grey too. I'm sort of not going for any of the ones for this, just purely because I kind of don't want it to be too light. So I'm pressing a little bit of the warm grey 2 down, and then I'm just going to go over with a bit of the raw umber 10%, just again through those sort of slightly darker areas. Well, where it sort of transitions, we've got a dark area through here and a dark area here, and it's a little bit lighter in the middle, but we kind of want it to transition and look like a smooth sort of graduation. So it's almost like a bit of a curve. So you've got a shadow down here, a highlight, and then a shadow again. So we're just trying to, I know it's quite daunting going in with like the warm grey 2 instead of the 1, and using the French grey and things like that. But ultimately, when we start adding a little bit more depth, so for example, if I was to take this as our sort of detail layer, and do like a demonstration. So if I take some of this is the warm grey 6 from the Polychromos, I sort of go in and start to lightly build up the sort of a bit of the detail. You can hopefully see how, I mean, I'm just using very light pressure, but you can see almost how dark it makes the area around. And that's just, it's not going in with any sort of real dark areas, but it means that this area is super light still. And then obviously you can just go and blend a little bit the Payne's Grey, 30%. And some more of that warm grey 6. For those super dark areas that's just below here, I'm gonna, because it's got almost like a very deep dark brown tone, I'm just gonna take some of that dark sepia. And adding this in, you can instantly see how dark it's made that area look. And then I would just also take a little bit of Cold Grey 6, just again in some of those darker, sort of cooler toned areas. So where it starts to transition from that real dark marking that we're just adding with the black. So just one thing I would always recommend is using tiny little pencil strokes and just always pulling it down into that lighter area. It's going to create a much more gradual, smoother transition. The thing is with working with coloured pencil, you do have to rework a few areas every now and then because you do get a little bit of lift, and that's completely normal. If you want to, again, make any of these real darker areas a lot more pigmented, just take a bit of dark indigo from your luminance and just gently go over any of these really dark areas, and it's adding that tiny bit of sort of more depth, and it works so well, especially in those cooler toned areas. You can just hopefully see how much it just goes, it just lifts it up so much. And you can definitely use it in some of those darker areas over the sort of super dark brown bits. I'm just going to map out a little bit of the area underneath. It's got a very much like a cooler sort of slightly bluey tone, so again just going to use a little bit the Cold Grey 2 just to start establishing. And there is quite a lot of depth and darkness through here, so I'm not too worried until we get to this bit up here about removing the graphite, because we will be going over it with such a dark colour that it's not going to show through underneath. I'm just adding a little bit of the Cold Grey 2 through there and just pulling it down slightly. And then again, some of the Payne's Grey. 30%. And I'm also just going to use some of the Sepia 50, just as a tiny little, like, more purpley browny tone. Through here. And again, just maybe a little bit of raw umber, just because it just helps create a bit of a juxtaposition and contrast against the blue tone. For those really bright areas, of course, we're just going to go in with a bit of white, just adding that as our base layer, because again, it's just going to make it easier to go over, and maybe using a little bit of a silver grey again as another sort of light base layer. Of course, as I keep saying, using the luminance just makes it so much easier to go over with the slice tool and create a real nice amount of detail. We do want to almost be toning the paper a little bit more. I'm really working on these bluey tones, hence why I'm just taking some of this 30%, making sure obviously we've got enough base layer underneath, and just creating now. I'm just going to take some of these 60, so the darkest Payne's Grey, and again just building up. And again, just bringing it down a little bit as well. To be honest, when we're working on this bit down here, as long as we've got a little bit of that blue tone showing through, to add the little tiny details, it's probably going to be slightly easier and a slightly better colour, because it's a little bit more neutral. It's a little bit more of that neutral grey. So I'm going to take some of the cold grey 6. Almost goes a little bit out of focus, so we want to keep everything super soft looking. So we can just almost take our luminance silver grey and just blending that over the top. And again, a little bit more of the Payne's Grey 60. Doesn't matter if we sort of end up filling this area in a little bit too much, because as I said, we can just come back and lift off with the slice tool. So, and that's why I'm sort of adding a little layer of the luminance down underneath the detail layer, just first of all to add a little bit more depth, but most of all, and obviously just blending and adding a little bit more of that silver grey. Making sure it's nice and smooth. And even though that initially seemed quite dark, once we start adding a little bit more of this detail layer in, it's not looking so dark after all. And again, just and you can definitely almost take to a little bit of the Luminance black. Again, this is a slightly softer black than the Polychromos, and it's a little fractionally sort of less pigmented and a bit smoother and softer to blend. So I'm just again using it gently, and you can almost maybe use a little bit of the sepia 50% as well. Again, just gently, just to create that transition in between that darker black and the more purpley tones of the shadow. And again, a little bit more of the Payne's Grey. And you'll notice the way that I'm not filling in this entire sort of space with the black. I'm just almost dotting and dabbing to fill in a little bit, but I'm trying to leave almost like some texture and some of that lighter marking showing through. Don't want to fill in the whole space. And then again, just going and adding some of that black. And then obviously once we've got a little bit of this sort of texture and detail showing through, or showing, obviously we do want to keep everything looking really soft. So we definitely do want to just be almost glazing a little bit of the silver grey over this side, just to pull down some of that detail. We don't want that to be so obvious. And then I'm just, as I said, going to take the slice tool. And we're just going to create some little sort of tiny highlights. Just by dabbing and dotting. Making sure we're cleaning off our slice tool. And just going over a little bit of the Payne's Grey. Just again, in any of those areas that just need a little bit more sort of tweaking. Sometimes we can make an area look a little bit too light. And we just need to almost like soften it out a little bit, which is again why we can just go in with Cold Grey. Payne's Grey 30%. And again, just glazing a little bit of the lighter sort of shades through of bluey tones, and again, just hyping up that contrast. And again, just to hype it up even more, you can take a bit of black and really sort of working, again, leaving out some of those lighter areas, so we're working around those darker shapes. So I'm going to take a little bit of this is Warm Grey 2, just because it doesn't really look that light, to be honest. I'm just removing the little bits of graphite. And I'm just going to lightly put in a bit of the Warm Grey 2. Just, I'm going to leave this area through here out for now, focusing on those light areas. So as I said, like, everything's on a curve, so we've got the darker shadow, it's light, and then it's darker again, so we need to be thinking about that curve, which means that when we sort of go towards those darker elements, so through here and down here and here, it's a lot darker. So as always, we're focusing on building the lightest colours first and blending some of the Warm Grey 1 with some of the Cold Grey, Warm Grey 2 with some of the Cold Grey 2. If you're a little bit unsure as to whether to be using warm or cool tones, you need to look within the reference subject, only within the subject. And the way I kind of figure it out is anything that's got a slightly bluer tone to it, sort of a bit more of an icy sort of coolness, then I'm going to use the coolest cold greys, and anything that's got a sort of umbery browny sort of olivey tone, that's when I'm going to use the warm greys. And if it looks completely neutral, like you just can't figure out, then just put some bit of both down. So there's some elements through here where definitely looks like you could get away with blending some of the cold greys in with that warm grey. And maybe even adding a bit of the French grey, 30%. Or 60%, it's the middle one, so the 60%. And we're just going to look at starting to blend out from that shadow. So it's a little bit darker, but this is very much a warm tone, so it's sticking within that colour spectrum. And as I said, we're focusing on adding a bit of depth through these darker elements, and then adding obviously a bit of a cooler tone into those brighter, lighter areas. And you can definitely, as I said, get away with just putting sort of a bit of both down, using a light pressure. Because we start to work towards those lighter areas, you could be using a bit of the one, so cold grey 1 and warm grey 1 at this point, but I don't actually have any, which is unfortunate, but there we are. Mine's run out. But I think because I know how dark I can make the areas around it, and also if you're like me and you don't actually have any ones, just remove all your graphite in those elements. Take a bit of white, so you can use the Museum Aquarelle or the Luminance. I've just got the Luminance white here. Put in a little layer of the white over those brighter areas, and then just take your cold grey 2 and run it over, and that will just diffuse that colour. So it will give you a little bit of a bluer, cooler tinge, but it will still keep everything very, very light. And again, just blending everything out. And adding some cold grey in with that warm grey. So again, just create a little bit more depth. I'm also just going to take a little bit of the raw umber 10%, and just again, just adding a really light layer over those warmer toned areas. And you could probably just very gently glaze a little bit of the 50% raw umber as well, just to give it a little bit more of that olivey sort of tone. And then, because as I said, we really want to be building up the depth through here, so I'm going to be taking some of the warm grey 6 and just going in quite confidently, starting to add some of that texture, some of the details. So obviously we're making sure we've got enough base layer down to carry this colour on top and for it to go down really, really smoothly. And you can just add these almost tiny little pencil strokes. Now I am going obviously in the direction of the fur. If it's a really, really dark area, then I'm just also going to just take a bit of black, just trying to leave a little bit of lightness showing through, but it doesn't really matter if we don't, because again, the slice tool will come in super handy. So I'm always just trying to focus on the direction of the detail that I see. And then again, just so you can see, hopefully by now, that I'm just trying to create quite a lot of depth and shadow towards the base and towards the inner, this part of the eye, using a light pressure go through here and then building up a little bit more texture through that side. But again, just trying to draw in the shapes that we can see. And through here, again, if we were wanting to add a slightly sort of darker tone before going in with the warm grey, with the warm grey 6, I'm just going to take a little bit of the warm grey 4. Now obviously, yes, I know I've put down a bit of the cool grey, but in comparison to how much raw umber I've added, I think I can get away with putting down a little bit more of the warm grey 4, just again to help darken that area a little bit. And I'm not interested in sort of getting too much of a blend going on, as long as it does look a little bit blended between the raw umber and the French grey, because when we start going over it with the detail from the warm grey 6, that will sort of help just cover up that sort of little line going on through there. So again, just starting to add all of the detail. So I'm rotating my pencil every sort of couple of pencil strokes, very, very subtly, but it's just going to help me keep that end point of my pencil super, super sharp. So I'm going to get all those little details, and it saves me sharpening all the time. Then, I can use a lighter pressure as we start working towards those lighter areas that don't have as much detail down. Again, just lightly adding in. Little bits of texture. Again, working in the direction that we can see the detail going in the reference photo. And then again, just taking some of the warm grey 2, adding a little bit more over this side here. And again, like I did before, just adding a bit of the raw umber, which is going to help just add a little bit more of that olivey tone, making areas fractionally warmer. And then just taking again a little bit more of the warm grey 6. I'm also just going to blend a little bit of the Cold Grey 4 over just above the eye here, because it does look like there's a little bit of a cooler kind of tone going on. There's definitely like a little bit of a bluey kind of feel. And again, it might just be a case of adding a little bit of some Cold Grey 4 with a bit of the Payne's Grey 30. I don't want to take it too high. Then again, I think this is the edge. It's you have to spend a little bit of time sort of mapping everything out, I think. Now, I know this is going to be a darker area, so I'm not too far worried about removing the graphite. This goes round. And this is quite, I think this is still quite a warm area. So again, just blending a little bit more of that warm grey in. And again, some of that Cold Grey, Payne's Grey 30. And just moving and then going over as well, just in that warmer tone just above the eye. So it goes from being this sort of warm tone with a little bit of like a blue tinge, to again sort of this area up here which is a lot more orangey. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of that Cold Grey 4 just into that, again, that bluey sort of tinged area. And then again, it's a little bit more of that Payne's Grey 30. And some of the Cold Grey 4 on top. So we're just blending a lot of colours in just to get to the right sort of level of depth. I'm not focused on adding the detail above it at the moment. I'm just trying to get the sort of colour that we can see behind the lashes. And making sure that is sort of dark enough. Again, just a bit more of that Cold Grey 4. And we've got almost like a little bit of an orangey tinge down here, but I'm going to leave that at the moment and just continue to focus on adding a little bit more detail up here. Just save a little bit of confusion for now. And again, just going to take some of that warm grey 6 and start adding some of that detail. Again, just focusing on those tiny little hair strokes or detail markings. As I keep saying, this isn't obviously the darkest colour we can go in with, but this one's sort of great for just going in and adding lots of little details. And a bit of the Cold Grey 6, and we start working towards, again, that darker area just above the eye here. And then I'm also going to use just a little bit of the black and start blending a little bit of that darker tone in to add some of that detail. Again, pressing a little bit harder as we start working in towards the contour of the eye. And as I said, if you're getting sort of a little bit too, or not enough detail in, or it's going a little bit too dark, and just pull out a few details with the slice tool if you can, because obviously we've used luminance here, so we should be able to get quite a nice lift. It obviously won't be sort of bright white areas, but you'll be able to create hopefully just a little bit of texture. And just again going around. And then just taking a little bit of the cold grey 4. Not cold grey 4, so cold grey 6. And again, just toning almost the paper, just adding a little bit of texture. Obviously, on top of the eye here, we're going to be adding a lot of sort of lash detail almost. So you don't need to go in and worry too much about it, but we do need to add just a little something to make it look like there's that cooler tone. And just through here, it looks like it's got a deeper yellowy kind of tinge. So I'm just going to take a bit of the raw umber, 50%. I just tried the 10, it didn't really work, so just go straight in with 50. And then again, I've got physio on my forearm tonight, because one thing I really noticed, I don't know whether I've been drawing a lot more recently. It doesn't feel like I have, but in reality I might have just been putting in a few more hours and not really taking as many days off. But I'm getting almost like tendonitis in my forearm, which is crazy painful sometimes. And I should probably wear like a support on it, but I've got physio on it tonight. So I'm not focused on the like adding all of the lash detail. Again, I'm just trying to focus on adding a little bit of that cooler bluey tone behind. You can even probably take a little glaze. So when I say glaze, I mean just a light layer, just to help tone the paper. Or some of the Payne's Grey, darkest Payne's Grey from the Luminance. And you can just take a bit of black. Starting to draw in the base of those lashes, so you can kind of, we're not going to draw them all in individually, they sort of clump together. That's the most realistic way I find to draw lashes or anything like that, is you've got to kind of pay attention to the detail, well, the direction, the length, and how they sort of clump together. So you'll notice that I'm not just putting in a line and moving on, really sort of trying to work towards the base, making the base nice and dark. Base is generally a little bit thicker as well. So really trying to sort of work on making this area nice and dark. Just sharpened up my black as well, just to, again, because that can help just create a little bit more depth. So we almost do want there to be a little bit of lightness showing through underneath. We don't want to get rid of all of that area, but we definitely do want to make it as dark as possible. If you really, really, really want to go up, you can make it super dark. And as I said, just go in and use a little bit of the dark indigo. That will just, again, help to create a little bit more depth and also help with that sort of deeper bluey tinge that we can see. And then you can always just add some little sparkly highlights with a slice tool in the middle or in between those eyelashes. Just really working in that slice tool to bring out his bright whites a little bit more as well. I can hear Charlie snoring. Okay, so I'm just going to come back slightly below the eye. I'm just adding some of the Cold Grey 2 just over this line through here. And a quite heavy pressure layer because we really want this to be nice and smooth. Not too worried about the graphite because we will be going over it with a darker colour as well. I'm going to blend. This is one of those areas where it looks a little bit cool and a little bit warm at the same time, so I'm just going to take a combination of the both and just letting my warm grey sort of just come slightly below, because obviously we're going to be transitioning into that ochre peach, like yellowy kind of brown tone. There are a few elements through here that look like they're a lot warmer, so again just going to focus on adding a little bit more of that warmer tone. And then through the lighter areas, of course, removing the graphite. And let's go straight in with some of the Cold Grey 2. And this is, again, another one of these areas that are quite light through here, so I don't want to make it too dark. So I'm just going to put a little layer of the white down, then a little glaze over the top of some of the warm grey and a little bit of the cold grey. And ultimately, because I've used the white, I can obviously just go in and use my slice tool to lighten if need be, and removing the graphite underneath. Put in a touch of the warm grey. And some of that cold grey. And again, just going to take a little bit of the Payne's Grey 30 through some of those darker, cooler toned areas. Just, again, I always like to add a little layer of luminance where I can, just because it just makes everything, first of all, a lot smoother and softer. The luminance do the most beautiful colour range. And also you can use the slice tool over the top, so it's a no-brainer to me to use quite a lot of luminance when in my work, and also using some of the raw umber 10%, again just to help transition into those slightly warmer tone areas. Just gently and again just removing graphite. I couldn't really remove that, so I'm just going to go over it and hope for the best. It'll be fine. But ultimately, I'm really trying to push my base layers in, and make my base layers a little bit darker than maybe what I used to when I would work, just because, again, I find it a little bit easier just to control the layers on top. So really pushing all of it in, and then lightly going in with a warm grey 6 and just gently beginning to build up, just using, you know, a soft pressure just to build the transition between those darker areas and the lighter ones. And of course through here it is a lot darker, so again just going to focus on adding a little bit. Sort of a light layer, light pressure at first, just building up our contrast. And I think that's a really important element to remember as well, is that even though we're using a dark colour here, the warm grey 6, we really don't always need to go with a heavy pressure. Sure, when it's like a really dark area and we really want to emphasize that depth and create the contrast, we can, but ultimately if we use a light pressure you can still get a really nice result, and it just means you don't have to swap over your pencils as much. So like through here I can start to add a little bit of that detail, and because I put the base layer in, base layers we're going to show it, like, sorry guys, it enables it to show through underneath. And you can just create the control that you want, just really sort of gently and delicately. And ultimately just going in with a bit of black over some of those really sort of harsher, sharper details. It's quite an odd one for me to work on this one because, as I said, I've drawn it twice already now. Once in graphite and once in pastels, and I've got both pieces sat in front of me. And it's just quite interesting almost how different but also similar they look, like the two different mediums. The coloured pencil I'll show you actually, and the pastel. So here's the pastel eye, and obviously that's the coloured pencil eye. It is completely different, but also like so similar. And I thought the pastel would be a lot more vibrant, but I'm actually thinking this is just as much depth of colour, which is quite fascinating to me anyway. I'm also, I think through this part, going to take a little bit of the dark sepia, just because it's again a very sort of dark brown kind of tone. It's dark sepia from the Polychrome Moss. Yeah, so I don't really know how I feel about the whole like graphite and pastel. Like graphite one, again, you're never going to get, you can get a lot of contrast, but you're never going to be able to get sort of like the real depth of colour like that you can obviously get with, because obviously you're working in grayscale, that you can get with pastels and pencils. But yeah, I think it's quite fascinating. It's interesting to me anyway, like how much these mediums are quite similar, like how the results of them are quite similar. Because I think I thought that the pastel one would be sort of a lot more vibrant, or have a lot more depth of colour almost, but I don't think it really does, which is, yeah, so quite interesting. So, and also with the colour pencil, obviously I've got so much more control. Like I'm
absolutely in my element here, just like putting in all these like tiny little details, and swapping between sort of using some of the cooler tones and the warmer tones. And obviously, yes, I can do that with pencil, but I don't get that with this much like control. So I'm just taking a little bit of the Cold Grey Sticks and again just lightly blending. Trying to obviously leave a little bit of that lighter area showing through over here. Ultimately trying to make it super dark and going over just some of those really dark shadowy shapes with a bit of black. Sometimes we don't need to add every single element of detail, even though I really do always want to. Sometimes I put it all in and then I realise that it was a little bit too much, and we actually just need to focus on adding some of those shapes. I'm also going to just use a little bit of the raw umber 50% just over the top. Again, it's just going to help create and then again just adding more of the dark sepia, using a light pressure as we start to work into those lighter areas a little bit. And ultimately we do need a little bit of a shade underneath, so a little bit of warm grey 4 just help kind of create a little bit of sort of contrast between those light and the darks. So it's just helping to balance. And again, a little bit more of the black. And I'm just going to take a little bit of the raw umber, 10%, and just blending over the top through those lighter areas again. Not through all of it, but just again to help smooth them down. And create it, and also maybe a little bit of white. Just again to help soften and create a nice transition of that lightness.
And then we can again just take the slice tool and just work through adding these little lighter details. And again, just blending out any areas that have gone a little too much, just by taking a little bit of white over the top. And again, a little bit more of that dark sepia. And again, just using some of the black, just to really emphasise some of that depth. And again, just blending some of that warm grey with some of the cooler cold grey tea. So the warm grey tea and our cold grey tea. And again, just blending them out over the top of each other and removing the graphite. Coming down with a bit more of the warm grey. You hopefully see just by adding sort of a combination of the two colours, it just makes such a difference, and it kind of creates this real element of depth without really doing much. And again, just really making sure our darks are dark enough. And then a little bit of the warm grey 6, again, just to kind of come and add a little bit more depth through here. Now obviously, as I keep saying, we've got the slice tool, so any elements that, you know, kind of go a little bit too dark, we can just really lighten them just by scratching off a little bit of that pigment. And then where I've added a little bit more of that sort of warm and cold grey underneath. I'm just going to take some of the cold grey 6. And this is where it sort of gets a little bit out of focus. There's not an awful lot of detail, but there's quite a lot of depth. So we really need to be making sure we're making this as dark as it needs to be. And to add a little bit more depth, I'd recommend going over the cold grey with a bit of warm grey 6. Warm grey 6 just seems to have a bit more pigment to it. And it's not going to make an awful lot of difference because this area it is just quite dark. So sort of just blend. And again, just blending some of that cold grey. And a little bit of the warm grey. Just again mapping out with a bit of warm grey 6 just in the darker areas through there a little bit. Now I'm not working too much into the lower portion of this, lower bit, because again we want to be blending, but I just want to add a little bit of warm grey detail. Again, just being able to leave out a little bit those lighter areas. It's really important. Just blending out any harsher lines with a bit of the white as well. Just adding a tiny bit of black. Again, just to add a fraction more depth into the lower portion. And then again, through that darker shadow area through here, I'm just going to take some of the dark indigo. Just again, and maybe a little bit through here, just to add that little bit more richness to the black. And then I think I'm just gonna add a bit of the burnt ochre, 10%, straight in there like that, and then go in over the top with a little bit of the burnt umber. Again, just pinning out this sort of brown kind of tone, smoothing that in, going over the top of that, or over that sort of hard, that far edge through this, where I've just put that warm grey, with a bit of the dark sepia, or darkest sepia from the luminance, just glazing it over that orangey brown that we've just put in, and then on the edge, those darker areas, adding just a tiny bit of the dark sepia and just blending that in like that as well to create that really dark area. And then obviously the black to add our lashes. And again, just focusing on adding the depth and the blackness. Just taking a little bit more white and again just blending out any of those harsher lines, and then going over it with the slice tool just to pull out a few of those lighter elements. And that is, I think, going to be where I end this first part. I feel like I've accomplished quite a lot today, so quite happy with that. Just using a little bit of black just to glaze, blend it over the top.